The body of Saint Rita was preserved here in this well-guarded place inside the church. If you look at the feet, for example, they are quite dry. If we look at Saint Rita's face, it also looks dry, as if it had gone through a mummification process. This rock is one of the holiest and most important sites in the history of Saint Rita. It's where she used to come to meditate, wanting to talk to God. If I want to talk to God, I have to be alone, I have to turn off the light, I have to quiet my voice, I have to find peace. Have you ever faced the impossible? Think about it. Have you ever in your life found yourself like this, facing an abyss like this one here in Cascia, Italy? Has life ever put a challenge in front of you that seemed insurmountable? And what did you do when faced with that challenge? Did you wait? Did you look for a better moment? Did you back down? Or did you take a risk? O powerful and glorious Saint Rita, called the Saint of Impossible Causes, advocate of desperate cases, helper in the final hour, refuge and shelter from the pain that drags us to the abyss of sin and despair. With complete confidence in your power, before the Sacred Heart of Jesus, I turn to you in this difficult and unforeseen case that painfully weighs on my heart. She was born Margherita Lotti in 1381 here in the region of Perugia, which at the time was part of the Papal States. And today all of this is part of Italy. The origin of the name is the Greek word margaritz, which means pearl in Greek or margarita in Latin. And from Margherita we quickly get to the nickname Rita. It is said that her parents were already elderly, like the parents of John the Baptist, and that the pregnancy was a great joy after years and years of infertility. When she was a girl, Margherita, who later came to be called Rita, was very shy, a very quiet girl. And she soon showed a desire to enter religious life. But her parents didn't want that because they had other plans for her. At that time, arranged marriages were very common, as they continued to be for a long time. And then Rita was forced to marry a man who she later found out was very violent. Right after she got married, still a teenager, she lived right here in this house. Rita's violent husband ended up being murdered in a family vendetta, a typical war between families in the region. One of those where one side kills someone, then the other side goes and kills someone, kills another, kills a cousin, kills an uncle, and so on endlessly. The couple's two sons were still young when their father died, and they grew up harboring a terrible desire for revenge that terrified their mother. In the face of all this suffering, Rita gave the first great demonstration of her commitment to the values that would become part of her story. She forgave her husband's killers. Rita would have even preferred to see her sons dead rather than turned into murderers. But nothing would be easy for her. Even though they avoided revenge, Rita's sons died. They were struck by the bubonic plague, a terrible scourge that killed millions of people throughout Europe. But then Rita was left without a husband and without children, and she went in search of God. I need to untie my shoes, loosen my tie, and let go of my fears. This stone is one of the most sacred and most important places in the history of Saint Rita. It's where she used to come to meditate. She climbed everything we just did, all by herself, wanting to talk to God. There's a tradition that says we can see here the imprint left by Saint Rita's knees. In fact, there's a deep mark that looks like a knee. And it would be the mark of the place where she stayed, right? The place where she stayed to pray, asking for her family's problems to be resolved, all the violence from her husband, then the persecution of her husband, and to the children. But that's a tradition. We can see a mark here, which could be from a knee. And a lot of people like to think it was from Saint Rita. After all the suffering, after everything we've seen, after a lot of meditation on top of the mountain, Rita found a new purpose in life. She wanted to join the convent, the nuns here at the Augustinian convent in Cascia. But then a major question arose. Could a married woman be accepted into the convent? She had already been married. Her husband was dead. Could a mother of 2 children become a nun? It was an immense challenge, because before becoming a nun, Rita was rejected 3 times. It's interesting that in Judaism, if someone wants to convert to Judaism, they also need to be rejected 3 times before being accepted. The number 3, as a form of acceptance, is very important, because it shows that the person truly wants to achieve that. And what tradition tells us is that on a certain night, Saint Rita had a vision. She was led here to the convent, and she was still sleeping at the door at daybreak underneath where there was a cross. After that, when the nuns found her there, well, they were sure of how strong Saint Rita's desire was to join them. They believed in the vision, and at the age of 36, Rita was accepted into the convent. Music. She spent decades living an ordinary life here in the convent, until Rita of Cascia went through a new supernatural experience. During a very intense moment of prayer, she asked Jesus if she could share in his suffering, but that this would happen out of love for humanity. And suddenly a part of Jesus' crown of thorns struck her forehead, and there was a mark left there forever, which many would call a stigma, which Santa Rita de Cascia would carry with her throughout her entire life. A stigma, or stigmata in Italian, it's a wound that actually exists, but it would have originated from some spiritual or supernatural event. As they tell us, for example, what happened to Saint Francis. And from the perspective of faith, having a stigma is like reliving the suffering of Jesus. That's why Saint Rita of Cascia is always depicted with a stigma. There is a tradition that tells us that when Saint Rita died in 1457, the bells here at the convent suddenly started to ring, without anyone having done anything, miraculously really. And right after that, they tell us what would have been another miracle. The carpenter who worked on Saint Rita's coffin, he came back saying he wished he had done a better job. He had part of his body paralyzed by a stroke. It's said that at that moment, when he came back wanting to redo the work and make it better, his paralysis was cured immediately. And from then on, a series of miracles began to happen, attributed to Saint Rita of Cascia. Even though it took almost 200 years for her to be beatified, the faithful in the region began to refer to her as the saint of impossible causes. The recognition was only possible thanks to local devotion and the direct involvement of a powerful cardinal. The canonization process of Rita of Cascia, it was very slow and marked by interruptions. until at the end of the 19th century, more than 400 years after her death, miraculous cures were attributed to her intercession. In one of the cases, Cosmo Pellegrini recovered from serious digestive problems. He had already received the last rites and was on the verge of death. In another case, the girl Elisabetta Bergamini recovered from blindness caused by smallpox. The canonization took place in the year 1900, but even at the moment when the miracles attributed to Saint Rita were recognized, a great pilgrimage movement began here in Cascia. At that time, the construction project also started, of the Basilica dedicated to Saint Rita of Cascia. And there was no more suitable place than this, where she spent most of her life, in the convent, in the monastery, dedicated to a work which has left its mark to this day. The monastery and convent here were first built in the 12th century. Already in the 18th century, an expansion was sponsored by King John V of Portugal. He attributed to Rita's intercession the cure of a serious illness he had. A few years after Rita of Cascia became a saint, in 1937 the sanctuary and the basilica began to be built. It took 10 years until the devotees could finally start visiting the place. Hail Rita, vessel of love, bride of Christ in pain, born from the thorns of the Savior, beautiful as a rose. Some important moments in the life of Saint Rita were depicted in a large sculpture at the portal at the entrance of the Basilica. In this sculpture we see Saint John the Baptist on the left, Saint Rita praying, next to her Saint Francis and Saint Augustine. Who is the patron of the order of the Augustinian nuns here in Cascia? In this sculpture, we see the moment of Rita's husband's death. She is with her two sons, and her husband is on the ground. And right above, the moment that we imagine that it was. The husband's farewell, Saint Rita's prayer, supported by an angel. Rediscovering her mission. Here is the moment they tell us about that Saint Rita had, a part of the crown of thorns, striking her forehead, but here depicted with a communication from her. Jesus Christ, it's a moment of closeness with Jesus. Here we see the final moments of Saint Rita's life, receiving a rose from one of the nuns. And in the last one, death of the saint. She too, accompanied by the sisters. And here is the body. The preserved body that is kept here today in the Basilica, which we are going to visit now. The body of Saint Rita has been preserved here in this place, very well kept inside the church, in a glass coffin so that her body could be seen and visited. What tradition says is that in 1627, when the body of Saint Rita was exhumed, already 2 centuries after her death, it was said to have been found incorrupt, that is, exactly as it was at the moment of her death. This is a tradition. We don't have an official confirmation from the Vatican. And there is also a tradition, a belief that says Saint Rita moves her eyes from time to time. From what we see in several churches, in several cases of saints, many bodies were really taken care of afterwards. But what draws attention in the body of Saint Rita is a degree of mummification. If you look at the feet, for example, they are quite dry, as if they were exactly as they were in her coffin. If we look at the face of Santa Rita, for example, it also looks dry, as if it had gone through a mummification process. Of the preserved bodies I've seen, this is the one that most makes me think it was placed in this glass coffin exactly as it was at the moment of exhumation, without any interference. So in fact, when we see this body, we're seeing the dead body of Saint Rita of Cascia.
Se eu quiser falar com Deus, tenho que me aventurar, tenho que subir ao céu, decidido pela estrada que ao findar vai dar em nada, 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 nada do que eu pensava encontrar.